Instead, I think the history of the Age of Empire is about why that decision was made. How people went from saying that person's different to saying that person is better than I am, or that person is not as good as I am. All right? All right. The very earliest moments of the Age of Empire are sometimes thought of as periods of exploration. And the first European people to really move outside of Western Europe and attempt to discover the west of the world were the Portuguese. And Portugal at this time was not a wealthy European nation. Right? It didn't have a lot of land and didn't have a lot of arable land. So to a certain extent, its maritime, or its effort at discovery through the sea was out of necessity. And it launched ships sailing south along the coast of West Africa with the idea that there were riches to be had. Most of the riches in Western Europe at this time were actually stuff that was made somewhere else. Things like manufactured goods, cloth, ceramics, were largely made in South Asia, India, in other words, or in China. And they paid for it with what gold and what silver they had. Another really valuable good at the time was something that couldn't be grown in Western Europe, but was really valuable. Spices, things that would make their food taste better. And it was these sorts of materials that Portugal was hoping to acquire, and to acquire by cutting out the middleman, and therefore making kind of a bigger profit. So they went abroad to do it, and sailed around the southern coast of Africa. Now, at the same time, roughly the same time, this is a story most of us are familiar with, the Spanish set sail for the New World. This is a story that all of you guys learned back in grade school, right, about Christopher Columbus, the establishment of early colonies in the New World. The first efforts in the Western Hemisphere, in the Americas, were largely to get things that were inherently valuable to Western Europe. Now, what that meant at first was gold. But gold actually was something that wasn't in great abundance in the Western Hemisphere. Very quickly thereafter, it was silver that was acquired via mining. And this seems innocuous stuff. It seems that it's not necessarily entirely devastating, right? But what this leads to eventually, in large mining camps, was the need to, in some way, sustain them. And so large, what are sometimes called haciendas, large farms were established in the Western Hemisphere in order to really feed those mining camps. And so originally, large farms, which would become eventually plantations, and the foundation for what we remember as plantation slavery, the first model for that was largely to keep silver mining going. Now, what I think is most interesting about this period of time, from about 1500 to around 1700, is something that biologists, anthropologists, historians call the Columbian Exchange. This isn't referring to the country of Colombia, which would give it a very different sort of meaning. The Columbian Exchange, named after Columbus, is a wider phenomenon. It means all the stuff that went back and forth between the old world, just to say Africa, Europe, and Asia, and the Americas. And this included things like crops. Believe it or not, it sounds strange, but Italian food, up until the 16th century, after ships had already crossed and made their way to the Americas, Italian food didn't have tomatoes. Weird, huh? Right? Strange. In Ireland, in England, in Northern Europe, they didn't have potatoes. That was also something that came from the New World. Here in the New World, they had next to no domesticated animals. There were no horses, no cattle, no pigs, and, which would have been very difficult for me, no chicken. So the exchange of livestock and the exchange of crops. Oh, I forgot the most important two. For most of you, chocolate was actually coming from the New World and made its way to Europe. So Swiss chocolate was unthinkable in the 14th century, and then became object of very nearly everyone's obsession thereafter, right? And coffee came from the old world. It was later cultivated in Brazil, and some of the best coffee in the world comes from there. And so all of these crops and livestock certainly made the world a more interesting place, and for a lot of people actually meant that areas in their, especially in Europe, where maybe there was marginal territory, parts of their farms that weren't very productive, where they were trying to grow wheat, now they could grow, for instance, potatoes. And it made it possible for their subsistence effort, for their ability to feed themselves, to be a lot more flexible, for them to just plain have a lot more food. This is an important thing to keep in mind later on. As a result of this, Western European population increases greatly as a result of the Columbian Exchange. This isn't the only thing that passes back and forth, though, when people meet. Unfortunately, something else was exchanged during the Columbian Exchange, and that is disease. I'm supposing that most of you know about the nature of disease exchange between the Western Hemisphere and the Eastern Hemisphere. Right? A series of diseases coming largely from the Eastern Hemisphere made their way to the Native Americans, what are in South America called Amerindians. These included flu. There was no flu in the Western Hemisphere prior to the European discovery of the Americas. Pig flu, tuberculosis, measles, mumps. All of these are old world diseases that simply didn't exist for Native American and Amerindian populations. The effects of this were devastating. They had no immunity, no antibodies. Their immune systems could not fight off these diseases. It meant enormous demographic decline. For instance, in just a couple of decades, native Mexico saw about 4/5 of its population decimated. 4/5, 80%. All right? All right. Diseases did not so much make their way back to the Eastern Hemisphere. We're not sure. It may be that syphilis was a disease that we have in the Western Hemisphere, but by and large, diseases passed in one direction. And that would have a pretty significant role to play in the subsequent settlement of the Western Hemisphere. A myth started to develop in North America, an idea that there weren't any people, that the land was wide open. And that would have a pretty important role to play in American history, right? You'll learn about manifest destiny, the idea of a wide open West that beckoned to people from the East to settle there. That land was, by and large, more open because of a large demographic decline that happened very suddenly. So this is a pretty important role to play in American history as well. With disease and foodstuffs, also people moved back and forth across the Atlantic.